Their car broke down on a freezing afternoon, and a quiet mechanic fixed it without a word. But what he gave young Keanu Reeves that day wasn't just a repaired engine. It was something far more lasting. Decades later, Keanu returns, with a gift that would finally say everything he never got the chance to. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sky over Toronto hung low with clouds the color of steel. It was the kind of cold that crept in through seams in your coat and turned your breath into smoke. Keanu sat in the back seat of the old brown sedan, knees pressed together, clutching his mother's scarf in his lap. The windows had fogged over, but he could still see enough to know they weren't going anywhere. The car had sputtered once at the last light, then again as they turned off the main road. Then came the sound, a grinding cough, a shudder, and silence. His mother, Patricia, had tried the ignition 3 times. Nothing. Just a low click and a hopeless hum. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel for a long moment, trying to steady her breathing. She was wearing thin gloves, and Keanu could see the redness creeping into her fingers. He didn't say anything. He never did in moments like this. At 10 years old, he had already learned how to read the tension in his mother's jaw, the way her shoulders sank when the world got too heavy. Today, they had tried to stretch her last paycheck into groceries, gas, and enough change to get them through the week. But now they were stranded in a quiet part of the city, blocks from anyone they knew, and the afternoon sun was already dimming behind the clouds. Patricia stepped out into the cold, wrapping her coat tighter, and lifted the hood of the car. Steam hissed. She coughed once, stepped back, and stood there, her hands trembling slightly, eyes darting toward the nearest storefront. Across the street, a small auto shop sat tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a pizza place. A metal sign read, "Donovan's Garage," slightly tilted and dusted with salt from the slushy roads. The garage door was open just enough to reveal a man inside, hunched over an engine block, shoulders moving in rhythm as he worked. Patricia didn't want to ask for help. Keanu could feel it in the long pause before she shut the hood again. But she turned and crossed the street, boots crunching over packed snow. The man stood up as she approached. He was tall, broad, wearing a navy jacket with sleeves rolled up and grease on his hands. His face was weathered, lined, but calm, not cold, not judging. "Afternoon," he said. Patricia hesitated, then cleared her throat. "My car, it broke down, just over there. I can't pay right now, but maybe you could just look?" The man studied her for a beat, then glanced across the street toward the sedan. He nodded once. "I'll take a look." And with that, Frank Donovan walked quietly into their lives. Frank crossed the street without hurry, his boots crunching across the half-frozen pavement. The wind caught the corner of his jacket, but he didn't flinch. Keanu watched him from the back seat, uncertain, his small hand still gripping the scarf in his lap. He didn't know what to expect. This wasn't someone from their usual world. Frank looked more like a statue carved from a different time. Patricia stepped aside as Frank reached the car. Without a word, he leaned in under the hood, his eyes scanning the engine like he already knew the story. He wiped his hands on the rag, reached inside, and tapped a few connections. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. "You try to start it?" he asked without looking up. "3 times, Patricia said. "Battery's weak, starter's on its last legs." He tapped the frame gently. "And the fuel line's shivering. She's cold and tired." Frank glanced up at Patricia, then looked over at Keanu. Their eyes met for half a second, and something in Frank's expression softened. "Give me 5 minutes." Patricia blinked. "But no charge," he said simply. Before she could protest, he ducked back under the hood and went to work. From his back pocket, he pulled a small flashlight and a multi-tool. His hands moved with steady confidence, as though he'd done this exact job 100 times before in worse weather. He didn't talk. He didn't explain. He just worked. Keanu slowly cracked the window and leaned closer, watching. He had never seen anyone move like that. So focused, so quiet. Most people who helped them always had something to say, some opinion or warning, but Frank said nothing. He just listened to the engine, adjusted what was necessary, and worked with a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. A few minutes later, Frank closed the hood gently. "Try the key," he said. Patricia got in and turned the ignition. The engine coughed, then roared back to life with a reluctant but steady hum. Patricia's eyes widened. Her hand flew to her mouth. Keanu felt a sudden warmth spread through his chest. Frank gave a small nod. "She'll get you home," he said. Patricia got out quickly. I don't know what to say. Thank you." Frank shrugged, wiping his hands on the rag again. "Help someone else when you can." He turned to leave, already halfway back across the street before Patricia could say another word. Keanu watched him go, a question forming in his chest. That was the first time he saw someone disappear before being thanked. Like it didn't matter. But it did, more than he could understand at the time. As the engine warmed and the heater began to trickle warm air into the cabin, Patricia got back into the car, her hands still trembling. Not from the cold now, but something else. Relief. Gratitude. Confusion. She looked at Keanu, who hadn't said a word since the man left. "Did you see that?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Keanu nodded, eyes still fixed on the shop across the street. The garage door was mostly down again. Just a sliver of light showed Frank's shadow moving inside, already returning to whatever work he'd been doing before they interrupted. Patricia sat there for another moment, engine humming steady beneath them. No lecture, no shame, just helped. She turned the car into gear and pulled back onto the road. The snow had started falling again, light flakes drifting lazily through the air. Keanu twisted in his seat to keep looking out the back window. He watched the sign disappear behind them. Donovan's garage. He didn't know the man's name yet. He didn't know that this wouldn't be the last time they'd see him. But something had settled in his chest. Something strong, solid, like part of him knew, on a level too deep for words, that a door had just opened. Back home, Patricia lit the stove and heated up a can of soup. She didn't talk much, lost in her own thoughts, but she was softer than she'd been in days. The weight in her shoulders had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it was lighter. As they sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising from mismatched bowls, Keanu finally spoke. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" Patricia looked up. "Who?" "The man from the garage." She hesitated, then smiled gently. "I don't know, but sometimes people like that show up exactly when they're supposed to." Keanu nodded slowly and returned to his soup. But he didn't stop thinking about the man in the navy jacket, about the way he spoke without needing to say much, about the way he gave and walked away like it didn't cost him anything. In the years to come, that cold afternoon in Toronto would become more than a memory. It would become a foundation. Because in the moment they were stranded, hopeless, and alone, a stranger fixed more than their car. He fixed something deeper. And from that moment forward, even if no one said it out loud, Frank Donovan was no longer a stranger. He was something else, something more. It started with the garage door creaking open again the following week. Patricia had just gotten home from a long shift at the diner, her back aching, when she heard a knock at the kitchen door. When she opened it, Frank stood there holding a cardboard box filled with tools and a bag of groceries tucked under his arm. "Saw your porch light flicker yesterday," he said. "Figured I'd take a look." She didn't know how to respond at first. The world had taught her to expect strings, conditions, explanations. But Frank just waited quietly, like someone who had all the time in the world and no need to explain what kindness looked like. She let him in. He replaced the bulb, rewired a loose connection, and fixed the back door hinge without saying much at all. When he finished, he put the groceries on the counter and turned to leave. "You didn't have to," she started. "I know," he said. then tipped his head slightly and walked out. From that day on, he came by once or twice a week, sometimes with extra firewood, sometimes with leftover stew, sometimes just with tools and a nod toward whatever was falling apart next. Patricia never asked for it. Frank never stayed long, but the house felt warmer when he'd been there. Keanu started to wait by the window on Saturdays. It became their silent agreement. Frank would show up mid-morning, knock twice, and Keanu would be ready with his jacket zipped and gloves on. Patricia would nod, hand him a thermos, and watch them walk off together down the street. Donovan's garage was quieter on weekends. Frank let Keanu sweep the floor, hand him tools, and sometimes, when no one else was around, help with small repairs. He didn't talk much, but he always explained the why behind what he was doing. Oil keeps the parts from rubbing wrong. Every bolt has a purpose, even the tiny ones. You don't rush a repair. You listen. Machines talk back. Keanu soaked it all in. He liked the rhythm of it, the patience it required. In a world that often felt loud and unpredictable, Frank's shop was steady, safe. It smelled like sawdust, grease, and old metal, and somehow that smell became comforting. Over time, Frank started showing Keanu more complex things: how to replace a belt, how to test a battery, how to listen for a misfire just by the rhythm of the idle. But what Keanu absorbed most wasn't mechanical. It was how Frank moved in the world. He never boasted, never scolded, never rushed. When something didn't go right, Frank would lean back, squint at it, take a breath, and try again. There was no panic, no pride, just patience and attention. Keanu tried to copy him without being obvious. He started mimicking the way Frank cleaned his hands with a rag, the way he stood slightly to the side of a car when diagnosing it, how he tapped his fingers on the hood when deep in thought. It was like learning a new language, one made of gestures, silences, and the occasional soft-spoken phrase. Back home, Patricia noticed the changes. Keanu seemed steadier, calmer. He didn't get frustrated as easily when his homework confused him. He took longer brushing snow off the porch. Even his handwriting grew neater. She watched him one Saturday night as he carefully rewound an extension cord without being asked, and smiled to herself. Frank never tried to replace anyone. He never gave himself a title. But he filled a space that had been painfully empty for years. Slowly, without intention, he became part of the house's rhythm. Sometimes he stayed for dinner. Patricia would cook something simple, baked chicken, soup, or pancakes if it was all she had left, and they'd sit at the small table like they'd done it 100 times before. Frank would ask about Keanu's classes. Keanu would share stories from school, the funny ones and the awkward ones. Frank would listen, nodding, occasionally raising an eyebrow when something surprised him. Patricia once tried to thank him properly. She waited until Keanu was in bed and poured Frank a cup of tea in the quiet kitchen. "You've been good to us," she said softly. "I just want you to know that." Frank sipped the tea and looked down at his cup. "I just fix what I can," he said. Then he stood, rinsed his mug, and left without another word. That was how he was. No fanfare, no expectations. But Keanu didn't need words. He felt it in every moment Frank knelt beside him, every time he placed a wrench in his hand without scolding, every nod of approval after a job well done. He wasn't just learning how to fix engines. He was learning how to become someone who shows up, without needing to be asked. One Saturday in early spring, Keanu showed up at the garage before Frank did. He swept the floor twice, arranged the tool cabinet without being told, and even remembered to open the vents for air. When Frank walked in, he gave him a quiet look that lasted a little longer than usual. "You're early," Frank said. Keanu shrugged. "Felt like being here." Frank nodded and handed him a pair of gloves. "Well, I've got a carburetor that's giving me a headache." They worked side by side for hours, with nothing but the hum of the shop radio and the occasional sound of metal against metal. At one point, Keanu looked up from under the hood, grease on his cheek, and said, "Do you ever get tired of fixing the same things?" Frank didn't answer right away. He finished tightening a bolt, then leaned against the bench. "No," he said, "because it's never really the same. Something small always changes. A part wears different. A tool slips. Makes you pay attention." Keanu nodded, but the words stayed with him for longer than he expected. That afternoon, Frank taught him how to replace spark plugs and then let him do the second set without help. When Keanu finished, Frank just gave a small nod. Clean job. It was the closest thing to a gold star Keanu had ever wanted. That evening, as they walked back to the house, Frank carried the empty thermos while Keanu kicked at loose gravel. At the porch, Frank paused, looking at the fading light. "You're a good learner," he said. Keanu smiled shyly. "You're a good teacher." Frank just tipped his cap and walked back down the street. Inside, Patricia stirred a pot of stew and asked, "So, what did you work on today?" Keanu answered without hesitation, going into detail about the carburetor, the plugs, even the trick with the flashlight Frank used to see into the dark corners of the engine. Patricia set 2 bowls on the table and sat across from her son, watching the way he moved, the way he carried himself. There was more certainty in his posture, less of the ache she used to see in his eyes. She knew then, without needing it said, that Frank Donovan had changed something in their lives. Not with promises, not with declarations, just by showing up every Saturday and letting a boy feel like he belonged. And that would be the beginning of everything that came next. The phone call came just after noon on a Wednesday. Patricia was in the middle of folding laundry when the school's front office rang. The woman's voice was clipped but polite. Keanu had been in a fight. He wasn't hurt, but he had thrown a punch. There would be a note sent home with him and a meeting scheduled. The tone suggested something deeper than just schoolyard trouble. When Keanu walked through the door an hour later, he kept his eyes down. His cheek was red, the collar of his shirt stretched and wrinkled. He dropped his backpack with a dull thud and said nothing. Patricia stood by the kitchen table, her arms crossed, torn between worry and disappointment. "I asked what happened," she said gently. Keanu shrugged. "It's nothing. They said you hit another boy. He pushed me first." She let out a slow breath. "Keanu, that's not how we handle things. You don't fix anything with fists." He didn't answer. He just looked at the floor. His voice, when it came, was small. "He called me broken." The word hit her like a slap. Patricia stepped forward to comfort him, but he turned away. "I'm fine." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. 3 soft, deliberate taps. Frank stood on the other side, hands in his coat pockets, expression calm. He didn't ask for details. He didn't scold. He just nodded toward the street. "Come with me." Keanu followed without hesitation. They didn't speak during the walk. The silence said enough. When they reached the garage, Frank pushed open the side door and flicked on the light. The scent of metal and sawdust filled the air. Familiar. Steady. Frank moved to the workbench and pulled out a square of rusted sheet metal. He handed Keanu a pair of gloves and safety goggles. "Put these on." Keanu did as he was told. Frank handed him a sanding block. "You ever sand metal before?" Keanu shook his head. "Good," Frank said. "Then today's a good day to start." Frank didn't say anything more. He just stood beside Keanu and showed him how to hold the block, how to apply pressure evenly. Keanu followed the motion, feeling the grit scrape against the metal. At first, it felt awkward, like he was doing it wrong. But Frank didn't correct him harshly, just gently adjusted his angle once, then let him keep going. The sound of sanding filled the room, slow, steady, repetitive. In that rhythm, something softened in Keanu's chest. His shoulders began to relax, his hands steadied. He watched the flecks of rust come off like old wounds, finally shedding their scabs. Frank picked up a second block and began sanding his own piece beside him. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "You know what happens when you rush a job like this?" Keanu shook his head, eyes still focused on the metal. "You end up making it worse. You grind too hard, you take off more than just the rust. You take off what's still strong. Keanu glanced at him. So, what do you do instead? You listen, Frank said. You feel the resistance. You let the surface tell you where it needs patience. Keanu looked down at the metal in his hands. It was still rough in places, but the center had started to shine. Beneath the flakes of brown and orange was something clean. Solid. Frank set his block down. Most people think you get rid of rust by fighting it. But you don't. You shape it. You work with it until what's underneath can breathe again. Keanu slowed his motion, letting the meaning sink in. His lip trembled slightly, and he turned his head away. Frank didn't press. He just handed him a fresh rag. Keanu took it, wiped his hands, and sat on the crate beside the bench. For a moment, he looked like he might speak. Then his shoulders began to shake, and the tears came. Quiet at first, then with long, gasping sobs. Frank didn't rush to him. He stayed where he was, allowing the moment its space. When the crying slowed, Keanu finally looked up, his voice breaking. I don't want to be broken. You're not, Frank said. You're learning where the cracks are. That's different. Keanu wiped his face with the sleeve of his coat. But it hurts. Frank nodded slowly. It's supposed to. That's how you know where to start. They sat there, just the two of them, in the warmth of the shop light. Outside, the world went on, but inside, something shifted. The sanding block lay on the bench, half used but still ready. And so was Keanu. When Keanu stood again, his hands were steadier, his face still blotched from tears, but something in his posture had shifted. He picked up the sanding block once more and went back to work. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Frank stood beside him for a while, then stepped away, giving him room. He moved over to the tool chest and started sorting through sockets, careful not to disturb the silence. The radio sat idle on the shelf. The only sound was the gentle scrape of sandpaper and the soft hum of something healing. After a while, Keanu spoke again. Do you think I'll get in trouble at school? Frank leaned against the bench. Maybe, but that's not the part I'm worried about. Keanu glanced over. I'm more interested in what you do next, Frank said. Everyone gets hit. Everyone hits back sometimes, but not everyone learns how to build from it. Keanu nodded, letting that sit. That night, when Patricia saw him come home, she expected more silence, more weight, but he walked in and hung up his coat without being asked. He set his shoes neatly by the door. Then he looked at her and said, I'm sorry. She didn't know what had changed in those few hours, but she saw it in his eyes. The fight had left him, but not in defeat. He was lighter, clearer, like someone who had walked through something and found himself on the other side. Later, as he got ready for bed, he opened the small drawer by his desk and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper. He began to write. Nothing long, just a few lines. He folded it again and tucked it into his backpack. The next day at school, he found the boy he had fought with. He handed him the note without saying a word. The boy looked at it, then at Keanu. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Back in the garage the following Saturday, Frank handed Keanu a wrench instead of a sanding block. Time to learn something new, he said. Keanu smiled and took it. That piece of rusted metal still sat on the shelf, half sanded, its edges smooth and gleaming. Frank never finished it. He didn't need to, because what he'd been shaping wasn't just metal. It was a boy learning that even when the world called you broken, there was always something strong underneath, waiting to shine. By the time Keanu was 14, things in the house had settled into a rhythm. Patricia worked long shifts, but came home to a son who helped with dinner and kept his grades steady. Frank still showed up every Saturday, and sometimes in between when something needed fixing. It was an unspoken family, formed not by blood, but by routine, care, and shared silences. But there was something Keanu hadn't shared yet. He carried it like a secret, one he barely admitted to himself. Between school assignments and evenings at the garage, he'd begun staying up late reading plays from the school library. Shakespeare, Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams. He didn't understand all the words, but he understood the rhythm, the stakes, the ache in the lines. There was something in the way characters said what real people couldn't, something that made him feel seen, even when he was alone. He'd started to think maybe acting was something he wanted to try, but the idea felt fragile, too personal to speak out loud. He worried what Frank would think. Frank, who knew how to fix things with his hands. Frank, who didn't talk about dreams, only work and grit and showing up. It took him weeks to build the courage. One evening after school, Keanu lingered at the garage longer than usual. He helped Frank change out a timing belt, then pretended to organize sockets just to buy time. When Frank finally set down his tools and reached for his coffee, Keanu blurted it out. "I think I want to try acting." Frank didn't say anything right away. He took a sip from his cup, then set it down and looked at Keanu, not with surprise, but with a steady sort of curiosity. "You mean in a school play?" he asked. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, maybe more." Another pause. Then Frank gave a single nod. "All right." That was it. No lectures, no teasing, no long explanation about how hard life could be, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if Keanu had said he wanted to learn how to rebuild a carburetor, and Frank had simply accepted that the work would be different, but still worth doing. The next morning, Keanu left for school early. Patricia had gone to work before sunrise, and Frank hadn't come by. Everything felt normal, but when Keanu got home that afternoon, something was taped to his bedroom door. It was a plain white envelope, no name on the front, just a single strip of black tape holding it in place. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a single ticket to the local high school's winter play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, opening that weekend. The note was handwritten in Frank's small, deliberate print. "Every machine starts with a spark. Go see how it's done." Keanu sat on his bed and stared at the ticket. He hadn't told Frank the name of the play. He hadn't even mentioned the performance. But somehow Frank knew exactly what he needed. Permission. Encouragement. A way to step towards something without feeling foolish. That Friday night, Keanu walked alone to the school auditorium. He sat near the back, the ticket folded in his pocket. As the lights dimmed and the curtain rose, he felt a strange pulse in his chest. Not nerves, but something else. A calling. The actors weren't perfect. Lines were stumbled, costumes were wrinkled, but there was a kind of bravery in what they did. Standing under stage lights, becoming someone else, trying to make a room full of strangers believe. Keanu didn't look away for a second. When the show ended, he stayed in his seat long after the applause had faded. Something had shifted, not in the room, in him. He walked home slowly, the cold air brushing his face. The streetlights flickered on one by one. When he reached his front porch, he found Frank sitting on the top step, a thermos of coffee beside him, looking out at the empty road. Keanu sat beside him. "Thanks for the ticket," he said. Frank nodded once. "Was it worth it?" Keanu looked straight ahead. "Yeah, I think so." They didn't say anything else that night. They didn't need to. A few days later, Patricia found the envelope and ticket stub on Keanu's dresser. She smiled softly, then walked out to the garage, where Frank was under a car. "You know he'll remember that forever," she said. Frank didn't look up. That was the point. What she didn't find out until months later, when she found a receipt folded in Frank's coat, was that he had sold one of his oldest socket sets to buy the ticket. She never told Keanu, but she knew Frank had always understood one thing. Not every gift needs to be loud. Some just need to be the spark. The following Saturday, Keanu didn't wait for Frank at the window like he usually did. He was already dressed, already outside, pacing the sidewalk in front of the house. When Frank rounded the corner with his hands in his jacket pockets, Keanu jogged to meet him. "I want to try out," Keanu said, "for the next play." Frank raised his eyebrows slightly, the smallest smile appearing at the edge of his mouth. "Good." Keanu fell into step beside him, matching his stride. "I don't know what I'm doing. I've never done anything like it." Neither did I first time I fixed an engine, Frank said. They reached the garage and began the usual morning routine. But this time, Frank handed Keanu a tool he hadn't used before, a torque wrench. He showed him the settings, explained the balance, and then stepped back. "It's about feel," he said. "You'll know when it's tight enough. Not too much, not too little. Just trust your hands." Keanu adjusted, measured, tightened. Frank watched quietly, then nodded. That's it. They didn't talk about acting again that day. They didn't have to. That night, Keanu sat at the kitchen table with a stack of script pages in front of him. Patricia came in from work, set down her bag, and saw him mouthing lines, pencil in hand, marking pauses and underlines like blueprints. She didn't interrupt. She just placed a plate of food beside him, squeezed his shoulder gently, and smiled. The next few weeks were full of quiet rehearsal and private nerves. Keanu didn't tell anyone when he auditioned, but when the cast list went up, he read it 3 times just to be sure. His name was there. Not the lead, but a role with lines. A role with purpose. He folded the list into his pocket, ran all the way home, and burst into the garage where Frank was working under the hood of a dusty blue pickup. "I got in," Keanu said, breathless. Frank slid out from beneath the truck, wiped his hands and looked up. "Good," he said. "Now the real work begins." That single sentence stayed with Keanu for years. Because it wasn't about praise, it was about preparation. And in that moment, something changed between them. Frank wasn't just the man who fixed things. He was the man who saw Keanu's spark and quietly helped him build the engine behind it. The day Keanu left home wasn't marked by tears or dramatic speeches. It came with quiet boxes, folded clothes, and a second-hand suitcase he'd patched himself. He was 19, full of nerves, with enough hope to make up for everything he didn't know. Patricia stood on the porch, arms crossed tightly, her heart in her throat. She had known this day was coming. She had prepared herself for it, or so she thought. But seeing her son, now taller than her, carrying his life in 2 bags, made everything feel too real. Frank was already outside by the time Keanu loaded the last box into the back seat of the used car he'd saved up for. He stood near the garage, one hand resting on the frame like he had 1,000 times before. The engine in Keanu's car was running, humming steady. Frank had tuned it himself the week before. He hadn't said anything while doing it, just handed Keanu the socket wrench and worked alongside him like it was any other Saturday. "Great a wrench," Keanu said, softly and laughingly. Now, the moment sat between them, quiet and still. Keanu walked over, hands in his jacket pockets. Frank looked at him, then extended a hand. Keanu took it and they shook firmly. Frank didn't pull him in, didn't offer a speech, just placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder and gave it a single grounding squeeze. "Remember who taught you how to fix things," he said. Keanu nodded, trying to swallow the knot in his throat. Patricia stepped forward then and wrapped her arms around her son, holding him tighter than she had in years. She whispered something only he could hear. Words meant for memory, not reply. When Keanu pulled away, he gave one last glance at Frank, who gave him a nod, then turned back toward the garage. No wave, no fanfare. Keanu climbed into the car, took a breath, and pulled out slowly. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw his mother still on the porch, hand raised. Frank was already gone from view. The drive was long, the road unfamiliar, but the engine purred the whole way, solid and steady, like a voice beneath him saying, "You're ready." The weeks that followed were filled with new cities, tiny apartments, and long bus rides to casting calls. Keanu worked part-time jobs between auditions, sometimes scraping together coins for dinner, sometimes going to sleep with a growling stomach and scripts tucked under his pillow. There were setbacks, rejections, cold waiting rooms. But he kept going. Every time something went wrong, a busted radiator, a jammed apartment lock, a flickering light, he fixed it himself. He could still hear Frank's voice in the back of his mind. Start with what you know. Don't panic. Fix one thing at a time. He never called Frank directly. He wasn't sure how to start that kind of conversation. Frank wasn't the kind of man who waited by the phone, anyway. But Keanu called his mother, sometimes twice a week, and Patricia, with her soft smile and steady voice, always made sure to pass along the updates. "I got a small role in a commercial," she told Frank one evening, while he changed the batteries in her smoke alarm. Frank nodded. "Good." He said the producer liked him. Frank didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Takes more than a smile to make it," he said, then added, almost like an afterthought, "But he's got more than a smile." Patricia caught it and tucked the words away. Months turned into a year, then 2. Keanu landed his first supporting role in an indie film. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pay rent and get his name out there. He sent a copy of the movie's VHS home. Patricia watched it 3 times. Frank didn't say much after viewing it once, except for, "He holds himself different now." From then on, whenever someone came into the garage and mentioned the kid on TV who looked a little like that quiet boy from town, Frank would just nod and keep working. He never bragged, never claimed any part of it. But he cleared a corner of the garage shelf one afternoon and quietly placed the VHS there, next to an old spark plug box and a framed picture of a vintage pickup truck. That was how he celebrated, by making space. And in his own way, he stayed proud from a distance, without needing credit. He never wrote letters, never called. But when Patricia told him Keanu was doing okay, Frank's shoulders seemed to carry less weight for the rest of the evening. Sometimes, on Sundays, Patricia would leave the back door open while she cooked, and Frank would sit outside on the steps with a mug of coffee, listening to the distant radio while she told stories about what Keanu was up to. "Had a line in that detective show," she said once, stirring a pot of soup. "Small part, but he delivered it real sharp." Frank nodded without looking away from the backyard. "Sharp is good. He's been sending money, just a little each month." Frank took a sip from his cup. "Told you he'd be the kind that shows up." One day, a man came into the garage with a flat tire and started talking about some rising actor in a martial arts movie. "Name's Keanu something," the guy said. "Decent kid. Heard he's Canadian." Frank didn't flinch. He knelt beside the wheel, wrench in hand, and replied without looking up. "Raised right." That was as close as he ever came to admitting how much it meant to him. He kept working in that garage for years. Never told anyone about the role he'd played. Never mentioned the Saturday mornings. But whenever Patricia would update him, he'd nod. And then, quietly, he'd go out back, light his old workbench lamp, and fix something. An old toaster, a rusted bike, a broken fan. He said he did it to keep his hands busy. But Patricia knew better. He did it to feel connected to the boy who used to sit on a crate beside him, asking about torque and tension and the way machines talked when something was wrong. He did it because Keanu still lived in the quiet spaces he left behind. And when the first magazine with Keanu's name on the cover showed up in the drugstore, Frank walked in, bought a single copy, and folded it into his jacket without a word. And he brought it home, wrapped it in plastic, and stored it in a drawer under the workbench. He never showed anyone. But he never threw it out. Because even if Keanu had left the neighborhood, Frank never stopped showing up. Not once, not in the ways that mattered. And as the world began to notice the young man with steady eyes and quiet strength, Frank knew exactly where that came from. It had been shaped, not by fame or lights, but by wrenches, silence, and a garage where someone believed in him before anyone else did. The script arrived folded inside a worn manila envelope, marked with an address Keanu barely remembered writing. The return label was from a Los Angeles agency, nothing dramatic, just typed black ink on white. Inside was the contract for his first major movie role. He didn't cry, he didn't jump or shout. He just stared at the pages and let the weight settle in slowly, like warm sun through cold glass. For years, he'd imagined what this moment might feel like. Now that it was here, it felt quiet, like something sacred. He called Patricia first. She answered on the second ring, and when he told her, she went completely silent. "Mom?" "You did it," she whispered. "I'm going to be in a real movie. Wide release, press tour, the whole thing." She exhaled, half laughing, half crying. "Frank's going to want to hear this." Keanu paused. Do you think he'll care?" "You kidding?" she said. "He watches every single one of your interviews. Doesn't say a word, but I swear, every time your name comes up, he turns the volume up just a little." That afternoon, Keanu wrote 2 letters, one for Patricia, folded around a plane ticket to the premiere, and the other for Frank. Tucked inside was a signed photo, not a headshot, just a quiet candid the studio had taken during rehearsal. He scrawled a note across the bottom. "To the man who taught me how to fix things, even when they weren't machines." He mailed both letters and tried not to expect anything in return. Back in Toronto, the envelope arrived on a Tuesday. The garage was slow that day. Frank sliced it open with a box cutter, glanced at the photo, then paused. He looked at the picture for a long time. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't call Patricia, he didn't say a word, just stood there beside the open envelope, the same way he might study a broken alternator before deciding how to fix it. Then he walked to the back of the garage, opened a small drawer beneath the toolbox, and pulled out a dusty black frame. He placed the photo inside, wiped the glass with his sleeve, and walked to the far wall near the shelf of spare parts. He didn't put it in his house. He didn't hang it near the register or the customer chairs out front. He placed it where he spent the most time, between 2 old tool cabinets, half tucked behind a box of rags and a socket set. The next morning, one of his regulars, a woman named Dolores who'd been bringing in her Buick since the 80s, noticed it while waiting on a tire rotation. "Hey, Frank," she called over. "That your nephew or something?" Frank didn't turn around from the engine he was leaning into. He wiped his hands on a rag and replied simply, "That's someone I'm proud of." Dolores smiled and didn't ask again. It became a quiet ritual. On slow days, Frank would sit in the back corner of the garage during lunch, sandwich in one hand, coffee in the other, and glance at the photo. Never too long, never with fanfare, but often enough. That month, Keanu's face started showing up on posters in shop windows and bus stops. A few customers made the connection. Frank never confirmed or denied. If they asked directly, he'd nod once, then go back to his work. At home, Patricia called Keanu one evening just before the film premiered. "You know he doesn't say much," she said, "but he's been wearing that same jacket you gave him in high school like it's new again." Keanu laughed. "He still has that?" "Of course," she said. "And get this, he wiped down the TV screen twice last week. Said it was getting dusty. You know what that means." Keanu paused. "He's watching." "He's watching," Patricia said. "And he's listening." The night of the premiere, Keanu stood on the carpet, lights flashing, voices calling his name. He did the interviews, smiled for the cameras, waved at fans, but just before the film started, he slipped into the back of the theater, away from the noise. He pulled out a small photo from his coat pocket, the same one he'd sent to Frank. He looked at it and whispered the words again. "To the man who taught me how to fix things." Back in Toronto, the garage light burned well into the evening. Frank sat at the workbench, polishing an old carburetor, a portable radio humming beside him. The movie wouldn't premiere in Canada for another few weeks. But he wasn't waiting on a screen. He already knew the story. And more than that, he knew the man behind it. When the movie finally premiered in Toronto, Patricia invited Frank to come with her to the local theater. She had 2 tickets saved and even picked out a nice sweater for him from the back of the closet. But Frank politely declined. "Crowds aren't my thing," he said. "You go. Tell me how it ends." She smiled, knowing better. "You'll watch it later, won't you?" He didn't answer, but when she came back that evening, she found the living room TV already warm. The VHS tape Keanu had mailed weeks earlier sat rewound on the coffee table. The only sign of emotion was the cup of coffee beside the armchair. Half drunk, long gone cold. That weekend, Frank didn't mention the film, but he did ask Patricia how Keanu was doing. She gave him the latest updates, new meetings, press interviews, a possible next role in development. His name's starting to mean something now, she said proudly. Frank nodded, then grabbed a wrench and slid under a pickup truck in the yard. Who always had the eyes for it? That was the most, he said. But back in the garage, the photo stayed in its frame. The glass now clean, the frame dusted once a week. It became part of the rhythm of the place, like the ticking of the shop clock or the creak of the back door. Sometimes customers would glance at it and say, "That's him, isn't it? The guy from the big movie?" Frank would nod. And if they asked how he knew him, Frank would pause, set down his tool, and say the same 7 words every time. "That's someone I'm proud of," is all. No story, no spotlight, just truth. It was all Keanu ever needed. And in the quiet, oil-stained corners of a small Toronto garage where nothing flashy ever lasted and everything worth keeping was held in steady hands, the face in that frame didn't belong to a movie star. It belonged to a boy who once sat on a crate with grease on his cheeks, asking how things worked, and to the man who answered, not with explanations, but with presence. The voicemail came in just after midnight, buried between flight confirmations and a script rewrite email. Keanu had been traveling for press, bouncing between cities, interviews, photo ops, and red carpets. Somewhere between Tokyo and New York, he missed it. "Hi, sweetheart," Patricia's voice said, light and breezy. "Just wanted to let you know we had a nice dinner for Frank's birthday. 70 years old, can you believe it? Anyway, he says hi. I saved you a slice of cake, even though I know you won't eat it. Call when you can." She didn't sound upset. She never did. But the words sat heavy on Keanu's chest. 70. He stared at the screen, replaying the message twice. He hadn't marked the date. It wasn't on his calendar, hadn't been flagged by his assistant, and in the chaos of a global tour, it had simply slipped. He picked up the phone, hands cold, and dialed the landline number that hadn't changed in decades. 3 rings. Then 4. Finally, a click. "Donovan's," came the familiar voice. "It's me," Keanu said, unsure if he even needed to say his name. There was a beat of silence, then the rustle of a chair moving back. "Well, well," Frank said, his tone unreadable. "Didn't think you'd be up this late." "I got Mom's message," Keanu said quickly. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. Frank cut him off gently. "Had cake. I'm fine." Keanu swallowed hard. "Still, I should have called. I should have been there." "You're busy. Life goes." There was no accusation, no coldness, but something in the voice didn't sound like the Frank Keanu remembered. It wasn't anger. It was thinner, like time had worn down the corners of the man who used to carry half a car engine without flinching. "How was it?" Keanu asked softly. "Low-key. Your mom cooked. Neighbor brought pie. Someone lit a candle in a donut. That was my favorite part." Keanu tried to laugh, but it caught in his throat. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm 70, Frank replied. "Everything creaks, but I still open the garage door every morning." They talked for a few more minutes, nothing deep, just surface things. Weather, a leaky pipe, the new dog next door. When they said goodbye, Frank's voice softened. "Just once." "Thanks for calling." Then the line clicked. Keanu sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the phone in his hand. He had dozens of unread messages, 2 assistants knocking on his door, and a publicist waiting to talk strategy. But all he could hear was Frank's voice, thinner than he remembered, speaking through static and years. He hadn't called in months. He hadn't visited in even longer. Keanu had always justified it. Life moved fast, his schedule was packed. He supported from afar. Patricia kept Frank updated. That was enough, wasn't it? But in that quiet moment, he realized what he'd missed. Not the birthday. The years? Frank had been there for everything. Every scraped knee, every bad grade, every cranky carburetor and awkward teenage silence. He never needed attention, never asked for credit. He just showed up. And now Keanu had missed the chance to show up for him. The guilt sat in his chest like a weight he couldn't lift. The next day, between interviews, he called Patricia. "Was it really okay?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't say anything," she finally answered. "But he went to the garage early that morning, stayed later than usual, and when I asked how his day went, he just said, 'Fine.'" Keanu waited. Then he added, "Didn't expect much anyway." Keanu closed his eyes. "I'm going to fix this," he said. Patricia didn't ask how. She didn't remind him that Frank wasn't the type to dwell or sulk. She just said, "You know where he'll be." That night, Keanu stared out the plane window as the city lights below blurred into one another. He didn't have a plan yet, just a deep ache to make something right. Not with flowers or a grand gesture, but by doing what Frank had always done, showing up, quietly, without expecting anything in return. He scrolled through old messages looking for an address that never changed. He found the one photo he'd sent Frank years ago, still saved in his files. He tapped the screen, held it for a beat, then smiled softly. The man who taught him how to fix things didn't just teach him with tools, he taught him with presence. And that was something worth returning. 2 days later, just as the sun began to settle behind the rooftops of their old Toronto neighborhood, Frank stepped out of the garage and paused. There, at the end of the driveway, was a black rental car parked quietly along the curb. Keanu stood beside it, dressed in jeans and a plain jacket, holding a cardboard bakery box with a single white ribbon across the top. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You lost?" Keanu smiled, not quite ready to speak. He held out the box. "It's not donut cake," he said. "But I figured you might let me try again." Frank looked at him for a moment, then stepped forward and took the box without comment. He turned toward the house. "You coming in or standing out here like a tourist?" Keanu followed him in. Patricia was already setting out plates. She must have known. She said nothing, just gave Keanu a kiss on the cheek and poured 3 cups of coffee. The house looked the same. Worn in, warm. Safe. They ate in the kitchen, shoulders brushing, no formality, no speeches. After a while, Keanu reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. "I didn't get you anything flashy," he said. "Just this." Frank opened it slowly. Inside was a photo, an updated one. Keanu on set, grease on his face, costumed for a mechanic role in an upcoming film. On the back, a handwritten message. "Still using what you taught me." Frank studied it for a moment, then slipped it into his shirt pocket like it was nothing more than a receipt. But Keanu noticed the way his hand lingered there, just a second longer. When the coffee ran out and the evening got quiet, Frank finally leaned back in his chair. 70 doesn't feel different," he said. "But knowing you remembered? That does." Keanu looked at him. "I didn't forget, I just lost track." Frank nodded. "Happens. Long as you find your way back." The garage stayed closed that night. The world didn't need fixing, not then. Inside, 3 people sat in a small kitchen, laughing over half-eaten cake and memories too deep to speak aloud. And when Keanu left the next morning, Frank stood at the end of the driveway. Not waving, just standing there, present, like always. And this time, Keanu looked back and didn't drive away until he was out of sight. It was a Thursday morning when Keanu decided no press, no assistant, no entourage. Just him. He booked a quiet flight, took the red-eye, and didn't tell a soul, not even Patricia. He wanted it to feel like the old days, back when a visit meant showing up, not announcing it through an agency or a headline. The cab dropped him off just past sunrise. The street looked the same. The houses hadn't changed much. Even the creak in the sidewalk near the corner still echoed under his feet. When he reached Frank's house, the garage door was already half open, same as it had always been, with the morning sun slanting in across the concrete. Frank sat on his usual stool at the back of the garage, hunched slightly over an open tool case, thermos of coffee resting on the bench beside him. There was a portable radio playing softly, Something old and familiar, jazz or blues, crackling through static like a memory refusing to fade. Keanu stood at the edge of the driveway for a second, then stepped forward. Frank looked up once, saw him, and just nodded. "Took you long enough?" Keanu smiled. "Traffic." Frank gestured toward the second stool, the same one Keanu used to sit on as a kid. Keanu brushed it off with his sleeve before sitting down. For a long while, they didn't talk. They just sat there, sipping coffee, listening to the soft sounds of the morning. Birds, the occasional car rolling by, the hum of the radio blending with the quiet hiss of wind. It wasn't awkward, it wasn't strained, it was just simple. After a while, Keanu broke the silence. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Frank didn't look over. He just kept sipping his coffee like he hadn't heard. But Keanu knew better. Silence with Frank always meant he was listening harder than most people did, with words. "I used to tell myself you understood, that I was busy. But it was just easier not to think about how long it had been." Frank set the thermos down and gave a slow nod. "You were building your road," he said quietly. "I was just happy to see your wheels roll." Keanu blinked and looked down at the floor. The oil stains were still there, like fingerprints, frozen in time. "I guess I thought there'd be time," Keanu said, "to come back, to say everything." Frank finally turned toward him, one eyebrow raised. "You here now, ain't you?" Keanu smiled. "Yeah." They sat a little longer before Frank leaned over and fiddled with the radio, trying to find a clearer station. A soft piano melody came through, warm and old. It filled the space between them like a memory they both remembered, but didn't have to name. Keanu reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope. "It's nothing big," he said. "Just a little note I should have written a long time ago." Frank took it but didn't open it. He tucked it into his shirt pocket without looking inside. "I'll read it when the garage is quiet." That was enough. Keanu looked around and smiled. "You ever think of leaving this place, even for a visit?" Frank chuckled. "Why would I?" "I don't know. A different air?" "Ocean breeze. This garage is all the breeze I need." Keanu shook his head, but didn't press. He knew better. "I could fly you out, first class. I've got room. I got a cot in the back room and a radio that still works." Keanu leaned back on the stool, the smile on his face soft and grateful. Frank added after a pause, "Home ain't a place you upgrade. It's the one you fix with your own hands. This," he gestured around the garage, "this is mine." Keanu let the words land. They didn't sting, they settled. He realized Frank wasn't staying put out of stubbornness. He was staying because he had already arrived. Keanu stood up, walking slowly to the back wall of the garage. His eyes scanned the pegboard where every wrench, every socket, every bit of hardware still hung in perfect order. He remembered helping Frank clean and sort them as a kid, placing each tool in its home like it was a sacred act. Next to the tool bench, the photo he had sent years ago still hung. The edges were curling slightly in the humidity, but the glass was spotless. Keanu ran a finger along the frame. "I didn't think you'd keep this up all these years," he said softly. Frank didn't respond at first. Then, from behind him, he said, "Didn't keep it up for show. Kept it up because some things are worth remembering." Keanu turned, his throat tightening. "I don't know if I ever told you how much you meant to me." "You didn't have to," Frank said, rising from the stool. "But I appreciate it now." They stood there, two men decades apart in age, but connected by something deeper than words. Hours spent fixing things, showing up, sharing silence. It was the kind of love that didn't ask for attention. It just endured. Keanu stepped forward and held out his hand. This time, Frank didn't offer just a shake. He pulled him in for a quick, firm hug. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. When they pulled apart, Frank looked him over like a mechanic checking one last time before handing back the keys. "You holding up all right?" he said. "Could use more sleep, but your foundation's still solid." Keanu laughed. "You always did give the best tune-ups." They spent the rest of the morning tidying up the garage, reorganizing a few toolboxes, and drinking more coffee than either of them probably should have. When it was time to leave, Keanu didn't linger. He knew Frank didn't believe in long goodbyes. At the curb, Keanu looked back once more. Frank had returned to his stool, coffee in hand, already flipping through an old car manual like nothing had changed. But something had. Keanu could feel it in his chest. Not closure, not guilt, just peace. He didn't know when he'd be back next. But now, he knew he didn't need to wait for the perfect moment. He just needed to show up, like Frank always had. The idea came to Keanu while he was walking past a vintage restoration shop in Los Angeles. There were old signs hanging in the window, faded lettering, hand-brushed wood panels, polished chrome, and something about them sparked a memory. Not of the garage itself, but of the feeling he had every time he stepped into it as a boy. Warmth, order, purpose. He made a call that afternoon, then a second, and a third. By the end of the week, he had a full crew on standby in Toronto, architects and contractors briefed with one strict instruction: change nothing that made the garage what it was, but restore everything that had been weathered by time. He didn't want it to be flashy, he wanted it to feel like Frank. The plan was simple. Frank would be away for a few weeks visiting an old army buddy out west. Patricia had encouraged the trip, subtly nudged by Keanu. With the house quiet and the garage empty, the work could begin. Patricia helped manage the details. She sorted through decades of old photos, tools, and paperwork. Every coffee-stained manual and rusted tin was cataloged, cleaned, and placed back in its exact spot. They kept the original layout of the workbenches, the pegboard wall, and even the oil stains on the concrete floor, faint but intact, sealed beneath a new clear coating. But Keanu added a few touches of his own. One drawer was lined with velvet and filled with brand new tools, wrenches and torque sets that matched the originals in shape and size, only cleaner, sharper, better balanced. In another cabinet, Patricia placed a black and white photo of Frank and young Keanu working together, taken without their knowing one summer afternoon. It had lived in a shoebox for decades, now framed and tucked near the radio. And above the main door, where the old wooden sign used to hang crooked from rusted nails, a new one had been carved, stained to look aged but fresh in its lettering. Donovan's Garage, Est, the day he showed up. That was Keanu's only request for personalization. No signatures, no dedications, just that one phrase. The workers finished ahead of schedule, every detail checked and rechecked. When they left, it looked like no one had touched it, and yet, everything felt new. Patricia stood in the center of the garage the night before Frank returned, hands on her hips, eyes shining. "He's going to say it's too much," she told Keanu over the phone. Keanu laughed. "He always does." "And then he's going to stand right there," she said, pointing to the center of the floor, "and not move for 10 minutes. Keanu smiled. Don't tell him I did it. Just let him see it." "Wouldn't dream of it," she said. The next morning, Frank returned home, stepping into the garage as the door creaked open. The sunlight poured in, warming the old concrete floor. Keanu had arranged for Patricia to be waiting just inside, her hands folded in front of her. She pretended to be busy with a box of spare parts. Frank stepped into the garage and froze. His eyes scanned the room, first the workbench, then the pegboard, the shelves of oils and paints, the old chair with its familiar wear. But something was different. Something was new. He walked slowly around the space, his footsteps muffled by the concrete. His gaze moved to the sign above the door. Donovan's Garage, Est, the day he showed up. His jaw tightened. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, taking it all in. Keanu, standing off to the side, waited. Finally, Frank looked at Patricia. "This," he started, his voice lower than usual. "This is too much." Patricia said nothing, but her eyes were soft with understanding. Keanu stepped forward. "It's not too much, it's just what you built." Frank shook his head slowly, still processing. His fingers brushed over the new tools in the drawer, the smooth wood of the sign, the photo of them together. And then he spoke, his voice quieter now, but filled with warmth. "You were always good with tools," Frank said to Keanu, the words taking a moment to land. "But it's not just about fixing things, is it?" Keanu swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. "No, it's not." Frank looked up at the sign again. His eyes softened as a rare, genuine smile broke across his face. "You're a good man, Keanu," he said, his voice low but full of pride. Keanu felt a quiet rush of emotion. For all the times Frank had never spoken about pride, all the moments he'd stayed silent, this one was different. This time, Frank's approval felt like the final puzzle piece locking into place. Frank turned back to the bench, his hand reaching out for a tool as if nothing had changed. But Keanu knew it had. Frank had accepted this unspoken gesture, just as he had accepted Keanu's quiet presence in his life all those years ago. Patricia smiled softly, watching them. She stepped out of the garage, closing the door behind her, leaving them alone with the hum of the tools and the soft music in the background. Keanu remained there, silently absorbing the moment. It was a new beginning, yes, but it was also a quiet continuation of something that had started long ago, with a broken-down car and a man who never left. This was home. This would always be home. And Frank, as always, was still here, showing up. Later that afternoon, Frank stayed in the garage longer than usual. He moved slowly from bench to bench, opening drawers, inspecting every small corner. It was clear he knew what had happened, who had arranged it, but he didn't speak a word of it. He just existed in the space, like a man visiting an old friend who had finally come back to life. At one point he sat on the stool, that same creaky one near the wall, and turned the radio dial until it landed on the blues station again. He leaned back, folded his arms, and just listened, as if letting the music settle into the new wood grain and fresh wiring. Keanu stayed nearby, sorting bolts into small cups and pretending not to watch. After a while, Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out the note Keanu had written him weeks ago, the one he hadn't opened until now. He read it once, then again, and then folded it gently and placed it in the top drawer beneath the wrenches, next to a roll of duct tape and an old cloth rag. "Nice paper," he said. Keanu smirked. "Figured it should hold up over time." Frank nodded. "It will." A knock on the side door broke the moment. It was a neighbor boy, maybe 12, holding a bent bicycle wheel and looking shy. "My mom said you might help," the boy said. Frank looked at the wheel, then back at the kid. "You bring tools?" The boy shook his head. Frank stood up, stretched, then pointed to the bench. "Then we'll use mine." As the boy followed him inside, Keanu moved to leave, but Frank stopped him with a glance. "Stay, could use an extra hand." Keanu nodded and stepped forward, just like he had as a boy, ready to hold the flashlight, pass the pliers, or learn something new. It wasn't just about the garage anymore. It was about the people who stepped into it, and the love tucked quietly between bolts, blueprints, and memories. Later, as the sun dipped low and the kid pedaled away on a straightened wheel, Keanu stood in the doorway and looked back at Frank. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The sign above said it all. Donovan's Garage, Est. The day he showed up. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Frank rounded the corner with a brown paper bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. He had just come back from the diner, same one he'd visited for years, where he ordered black coffee and the usual toast. He preferred to eat alone these days. The silence sat comfortably beside him, but today felt different, though he couldn't say why. As he stepped onto the driveway, something pulled at him. The garage looked familiar, identical in shape and form, but there was a strange feeling in the air, like walking into a memory made brand new. He clicked open the side door and paused. It was the scent that hit him first, not grease or gasoline, but clean wood, varnish, and faint lemon oil. The light filtering in through the cleaned glass caught the metal edges of his tools, now polished and ordered so precisely it stopped him mid-step. His eyes swept the room. The pegboard was intact, every wrench, plier, and socket in its place. The workbench glowed under fresh varnish. The floor was the same, only sealed now, the years of oil and sweat preserved in faint stains that had been honored, not scrubbed away. Then he noticed the napkin. It was framed in glass, hung with care beside the radio shelf, faded ink still legible in looping handwriting. The same napkin he'd forgotten about, tucked into his coat pocket years ago at that run-down diner after a long day helping a younger Keanu push his broken-down car across town. On it were 8 simple words, written by a teenager with calloused hands and grease under his fingernails. "Thank you for fixing more than engines." Frank stared at it. He didn't move. The bag in his hand rustled as his grip tightened. His eyes welled before he could stop it. He hadn't cried in decades. Not when his own father passed. Not when the army sent him into places no man should have walked through. Not even when his hands stopped being strong enough to lift engines like they used to. But this was different. This was love. Quiet, thoughtful, earned. Frank stayed still for a moment, his breath catching just slightly in the back of his throat. He wiped his eye with the back of his hand, pretending it was just dust from the air. But no one was fooled, not even himself. The garage felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Not because it was cleaner, not because it gleamed or smelled like fresh varnish, but because everything in it had been touched by memory, preserved, not replaced. He took a few slow steps forward, noticing details. The radio had been cleaned and retuned to his favorite station. A new light fixture above the bench shone down like sunlight, but with the same warm yellow hue as the old one. His old socket wrench, the one with the chipped handle he never threw out, had been restored and placed front and center on the pegboard. Then his eyes landed on the sign above the interior door, the one leading into the house. Donovan's garage. S. The day he showed up. He read it once, then again. His throat tightened. The room didn't spin, but something shifted in his chest, like a gear locking into place that had been loose for years. Then came the voice from the shadows behind him. "You built this," Keanu said gently. "I just returned it to you." Frank turned, slow and careful. Keanu stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, his face open but unreadable, giving space for whatever Frank might need to feel. There was nothing flashy about the moment, no music swelling, no cameras clicking, just 2 men, separated by years and circumstance, staring at a shared legacy made of bolts and paint and unspoken affection. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. He walked up and placed a firm hand on Keanu's shoulder, and the silence between them said everything. They stood like that for a long time. Then, Frank broke it with a quiet grunt. "You know I don't like surprises." Keanu smiled. "You knew?" Frank nodded once. Knew something was up. Just didn't expect it to feel like this. Like what? Frank looked around. Like home never left. They pulled up the 2 stools again, sat with mugs of coffee in hand, talked about nothing, talked about everything. And behind them, the napkin stayed in its frame. A small, worn reminder that sometimes the most important thanks come not in moments of glory, but in quiet spaces, after years of showing up without being asked. They talked for a long time that afternoon, the way only 2 people can when the weight of years doesn't need to be unpacked all at once. There was no rush. No pressure to say more than what needed saying. Frank told stories Keanu hadn't heard before, about the first time he ever fixed a car, about the one friend he lost overseas who never got the chance to open a garage of his own, about how, when Patricia first brought him into their lives, he thought, "This boy needs something solid to lean on." Keanu listened, every word another nail hammered into the framework of their shared history. At one point, Frank leaned back, his voice low. "You ever wonder why I stayed so long? Why I kept showing up?" Keanu glanced over. Sometimes, Frank gave a tired smile. Because the day I fixed that car, I saw something in you. Not just a kid who needed help, but someone who was going to give the world something honest. I figured if I couldn't give you everything, I could at least give you steadiness. Keanu's voice caught. You gave me more than steadiness. Fran shrugged. I gave what I had, and that was everything. They sat in silence again. Outside, the afternoon sun drifted lower, painting the garage in long golden shadows. Eventually, Frank stood up and walked over to the napkin again. He stared at it for a long while. Then, slowly, he reached up, took it down from the wall, and opened the back of the frame. Gently, he slid the napkin out and folded it twice. He tucked it into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt like it was a keepsake, not a decoration. Keanu raised an eyebrow. You're taking it down? Frank looked at him. It was never meant to be framed. It was meant to be carried. And just like that, the old man who never wanted recognition, who never asked for credit, gave himself permission to hold on to the gratitude he'd once brushed off. Keanu stood. They met again at the middle of the room, where the sun warmed the floor and the scent of tools and oil still lingered. I meant what I wrote, Keanu said. I know, Frank answered. That's why I kept it. They didn't say goodbye. Frank wasn't a goodbye kind of man. Instead, as Keanu walked out, Frank called after him. Next time, bring a wrench, we've got more to build. Keanu didn't look back. He just lifted a hand and smiled. The plan came together quietly, just the way Frank would have liked it, if he knew. But he didn't. Keanu made sure of that. No flyers, no event planners, no headlines, just a few whispered phone calls and handwritten notes passed around the neighborhood. Patricia helped too, baking enough food for an army and making sure the old community center on the corner was cleaned out and lit up like home. They set the tables with simple checkered cloths and borrowed chairs from the church next door. Keanu arrived early and stayed in the kitchen, peeling potatoes with the volunteers and checking on the casseroles in the oven. No one snapped pictures, no one asked for autographs. Tonight wasn't about him. It was about Frank. By 6 o'clock, the room had filled with familiar faces. Men Frank used to work on cars with. Kids he'd helped repair bicycles for. Mothers who remembered the time he showed up on Christmas Eve to fix a broken water heater. People who hadn't seen each other in years came back for this, and they all brought something to share, a pie, a photograph, Frank showed up just before sunset, led in by Patricia, who told him it was just a quiet dinner to thank some neighbors for their help fixing the porch steps. He walked in and stopped cold. The room went silent for half a second. Then, all at once, applause. Frank looked around, bewildered. What is this? Keanu stepped forward, holding a plate of buttered rolls. Just a little something for the guy who's been holding this neighborhood together for 50 years. Frank shook his head. You didn't have to. We know, Keanu said. That's exactly why we did. They sat him at the head table, surrounded by people who loved him and stories that stretched back across generations. Someone stood up and raised a glass. To Frank Donovan, he said. The only man I know who can fix a muffler, a broken window, and your bad attitude. Without saying more than 5 words. Laughter broke out. Frank just shook his head and smiled, eyes already misting. Then the stories began. One by one, neighbors and friends stood and shared, not speeches, but snapshots, little slices of life that added up to something much bigger than Frank ever knew. One man, now in his 40s, told the room how Frank had once stopped on the side of the road in the middle of winter to help him change a tire. I didn't even live on this street. He didn't know me, but he got out anyway, in that old coat with the ripped collar. Didn't say much, just nodded and handed me a wrench. A woman near the front wiped her eyes as she recalled the time Frank had fixed her back door lock after her husband left. He didn't ask why I needed it done, just showed up with his toolbox, told me every door should close easy and lock tight. Then he nodded and left. A group of teenagers, now in their 20s, stood up together and thanked him for teaching them how to change spark plugs when they were 16. "We were loud, annoying, and broke," one said. "He taught us anyway." Mrs. Laney, now nearing 90, took the floor with the help of a cane. The room hushed as she steadied herself, looking directly at Frank. "I lost my husband 20 years ago," she said, her voice thin but clear. "That first winter, I didn't know how I'd get through, but every morning there'd be a thermos of coffee sitting on my porch. No note, no name, just warm coffee in the cold. I knew who it was, but Frank never said a word." She paused. "Frank never asked for thanks. That's why he deserves it." The room went silent, and then came the soft clink of glasses being raised again. Frank's head lowered slightly, his hands folded in front of him. He wasn't the kind of man who needed the spotlight. But tonight, he let it settle over him, not as attention, but as acknowledgement. Keanu sat a few seats away, watching him closely. Frank's shoulders were hunched slightly forward, like they always were, but his eyes gleamed with something quiet and deep. Not pride, not embarrassment, gratitude. Keanu thought about all the years Frank had simply shown up, fixed what was broken, sat through the hard things without needing to speak. Now the town was speaking for him. And finally, he was listening. As dessert trays made their way around the room, peach cobbler, lemon pie, a chocolate sheet cake someone had decorated with "Thank you, Frank" and shaky blue icing, Keanu slipped out for a moment to refill water pitchers. When he returned, Frank was no longer in his seat. He found him outside on the community center's old brick steps, coffee in hand, looking up at the sky. Keanu sat down beside him. "Too much?" he asked. Frank gave a small shake of his head. "Just unexpected." He meant every word. "I know they did." Frank sipped from the mug, then glanced over. "You could have told me." "And ruined the surprise?" Keanu smiled. "You'd have fixed the sink or something just to get out of it." Frank chuckled. "That does sound like me." They sat in silence again, as comfortable as old boots. Then Frank said something so soft, Keanu almost missed it. "I didn't think anyone remembered." Keanu turned. "What?" "All the little things. Fixing bikes, helping Mrs. Laney, teaching those loud boys how to check their oil. I just did what felt right. Never thought it added up to much." Keanu's voice was steady. "It added up, Frank. More than you'll ever know." Frank looked down at the coffee in his hand. "Guess it's easy to forget how much the small things mean. Until everyone shows up to remind you." The door opened behind them. Patricia peeked her head out, calling gently, "You boys coming in for cake?" "In a minute," Frank said. She smiled and ducked back inside. Frank stood slowly, groaning like an old house settling. He looked at Keanu. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," Keanu said. "That's exactly why I did." They walked back inside together, side by side, and the room lit up again with laughter and second servings. Frank didn't say much the rest of the evening. He didn't need to. His eyes scanned the room, landing on every face, every family, every old friend, now weathered by time. They hadn't forgotten him. They had just been waiting for a night like this. As the last of the guests packed up leftovers and hugged their goodbyes, Frank sat one last time at the head of the table. Keanu came over, pulled out the chair beside him, and quietly slid a worn wrench onto the table. Frank looked at it, then at Keanu. "What's this?" Keanu smiled. "Just something to remind you. You didn't just fix things. You built lives." Frank didn't answer. He just picked up the wrench and held it like it mattered. A week after the community dinner, Keanu returned to Toronto for a few quiet days. No press, no interviews, just coffee with Patricia and long walks around the neighborhood. On his last night in town, he stopped by Frank's place to drop off some leftover parts for an old project they had started years ago but never finished. Frank was in the garage, as always. The radio was humming in the background, and the smell of engine oil hung lightly in the air. He didn't look up when Keanu walked in, just nodded and gestured toward the old tool cabinet by the back wall. "Top drawer," he said. Keanu frowned. "What's in it?" "Just open it." Keanu walked over and pulled the drawer open. Inside was a small, leather-bound notebook, aged. the edges worn soft with time, the spine cracked. It didn't look like much. No label, no lock, just a plain black cover and a thin leather cord wrapped around it. He picked it up carefully and turned back toward Frank. "What's this?" Frank shrugged. "Something I started a long time ago. Don't really know why." Keanu sat down on the stool beside him, turning the notebook over in his hands. "You wrote in this?" "Here and there," Frank said, almost embarrassed. "Mostly scraps, thoughts, quotes I liked, sketches too, sometimes." Keanu gently unwrapped the leather cord and opened the cover. The first page was dated 1981. The handwriting was blocky, slanted to the right. Under the date was a single sentence. The boy asked what makes a good man, still trying to figure that out. Keanu blinked, then flipped to the next page. A few lines about an oil change, a sketch of a carburetor. Then, randomly, a quote. "Silence is the armor of the honest." He turned another page. And another. Some were filled top to bottom with lines about the day's work. Others had only a few words. One just read, "Keanu smiled today. First time in weeks. Feels like a win." Keanu's throat tightened. Frank was watching him, arms crossed. "I didn't know what to do with it," he said. "Figured maybe now you'll know." Keanu held the notebook like it was something sacred. He flipped slowly through more pages, each one revealing a glimpse of a man who had always kept his heart hidden in the rhythm of routine and the silence between acts of service. There were quotes jotted down from books Frank had read, sometimes only half remembered. Things like, "You measure a man not by what he says, but by what he returns to. The loudest strength is the one that never needs applause." Here and there, Keanu found small drawings. One was a sketch of the necklace he'd given Patricia for her birthday the year he got his first paycheck. Another showed the outline of a garage layout, with new shelving scribbled in the margins and notes like, "Make room for his own tools one day." Keanu paused at a page near the center. It had no date, just 2 lines. "And left for Hollywood today. Didn't hug me, just said thanks." That's enough. Keanu swallowed hard and kept flipping. Later entries became more sporadic, sometimes months apart, but always sincere. "Saw him in a film again. That look in his eyes hasn't changed, just further away now. Told Patricia I miss him." Didn't say it out loud. Then came the one that stopped Keanu in his tracks. "You built a life, but he's still part of mine." He set the notebook down on the bench gently, then looked over at Frank, whose eyes were now focused on adjusting a bolt in an old engine block, like this wasn't one of the most vulnerable moments of his life. Keanu said quietly, "I don't know what to say." Frank shrugged. "You don't have to say anything. I didn't know you kept track like this." "I didn't either," Frank replied, "until I looked back." Keanu reached over and rested his hand on the notebook. "Do you mind if I keep it?" Frank nodded slowly. "That's why I gave it to you. Thought you might find something in there worth holding on to." Keanu didn't reply right away. He was too full. Of memory, of love, of a gratitude too large for words. And maybe that's why Frank never used many. He didn't need to. His life had already spoken for him. Quietly. Page by page. Bolt by bolt. Moment. They sat together in the garage for a while longer, not talking, just letting the air move around them like old friends. Outside, the sun was beginning to fade behind the rooftops, casting a soft amber glow across the floor. The kind of light that made everything feel like memory, even as it was happening. Frank leaned back on his stool and stretched, letting out a satisfied groan. "You ever think about writing your own story one day?" he asked. Keanu looked over, surprised. "You mean like a book?" "Could be, or just something that says what mattered, what you noticed when nobody else did." Keanu thought about that. "Maybe, but I think this," he tapped the notebook, "already says everything I ever needed to know about who I became." Frank chuckled. "Just make sure if you write it, you leave room for the grease stains." They both laughed. Then Frank stood up and went to the back shelf. From behind an old crate, he pulled out a narrow wooden box and handed it to Keanu. "What's this?" Keanu asked. Frank didn't answer, just gestured for him to open it. Inside was a fountain pen, classic, worn, the cap engraved with the initials FD. A small note rested beneath it, handwritten, for when the words finally come. Keanu stared at the pen for a long time. He remembered seeing it once before, maybe when he was a teenager, when Frank had been filling out a logbook and quietly scribbling in the corner of a page. He looked up. "You sure?" "I won't need it where I'm going," Frank said lightly. "But you've still got chapters to write." Keanu placed the notebook and the pen side by side, like they were two pieces of a puzzle just now fitting together. "You never stopped watching over me, did you?" Frank shrugged. "Didn't need to. You always came back." The garage grew quiet again. But this time it wasn't just silence. It was peace. The kind that settles in when something long, unspoken, is finally understood. As Keanu gathered the notebook and box, he looked around once more. Every wrench, every peg, every drawing taped to the wall seemed to echo with a lesson learned not through teaching, but through presence. Before he walked out, he turned and said one last thing. "I'll take good care of it, all of it." Frank gave a quiet nod. "I know you will." And with that, Keanu stepped back into the evening light, carrying not just tools, not just memories, but a living journal of everything that had shaped the man he'd become. A month after Frank gave Keanu the journal and the pen, a letter arrived in Keanu's Los Angeles mailbox from the principal of a high school in Scarborough. It wasn't a request for a donation or an autograph. It was a simple, heartfelt invitation. The auto shop teacher, Mr. Halpern, had heard about what Keanu had done for Frank and the community dinner that followed. He asked if Keanu might consider visiting his students, many of whom were struggling, uncertain of their future paths. Keanu didn't hesitate. He flew in quietly, no entourage, no press, just him, a backpack, and a small, carefully wrapped bundle inside. Patricia picked him up from the airport and dropped him at the school with a warm hug and a, "He'd be proud of this, you know." The school was older, bricks faded from years of winters and teenage hands scuffing the walls, but it felt grounded, honest. Keanu walked through the halls, unnoticed at first, which he preferred. The students in the auto shop class were already busy, with socket wrenches and oil-stained rags when Mr. Halpern introduced him. Heads turned, eyes widened. A few jaws dropped, but Keanu raised a hand and smiled. "Don't stop on my account," he said. "I'm not here to be famous. I'm here to talk about someone who mattered." They gathered around as he unwrapped the bundle and revealed a worn wrench, a pair of work gloves, and Frank's faded flannel. He set them gently on a workbench. "This belonged to the man who taught me what it means to fix more than engines," Keanu said. His name was Frank Donovan. He wasn't my biological father, but he was the man who showed up when life was falling apart. He showed up and stayed. Quietly, steadily, with calloused hands and a heart bigger than he ever let on. The students leaned in. No phones were out. No one was scrolling, just listening. He taught me how to change oil when I was 10. He never made speeches, never told me how to live. He just lived, with honesty, and showed up every time I needed a little more light. And even when I left to chase something bigger, he never once made me feel like I had left him behind. Keanu paused for a moment and ran his thumb along the edge of the old wrench. He used to say, "You don't throw heat, you shape it." I didn't get it back then. I thought he was just talking about metal, but now, I think he meant people. You don't just react to pressure, you learn how to absorb it, redirect it, make something solid out of it. One student raised their hand, hesitant. "Did he ever, get angry?" Keanu smiled softly. "I only saw it once, when I got into a fight at school. He didn't yell, didn't punish me. He took me into the garage, handed me a rusted piece of steel, and told me to sand it smooth. Took hours. At the end he said, 'That's how you deal with things that come at you rough. You don't smash them, you work them until they shine.' The class chuckled, but there was a deep stillness underneath it. Keanu could tell they weren't just hearing a story. They were imagining what it would be like to have someone like that in their corner. He continued, Frank wasn't rich. He never had a big house. He didn't wear a suit. But every person in our neighborhood knew they could count on him. He fixed cars, he fixed bikes, he fixed broken fences. But what he really fixed was trust. He helped people believe in good again just by showing up. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out Frank's journal. I want to show you something, Keanu said, holding it up gently. This notebook. It's filled with bits of Frank's life, quotes, sketches, scraps of wisdom. I didn't know he was writing any of it. He gave it to me when he thought I was finally ready to carry it. He opened to one page and read aloud. Saw him on screen again today. Same heart, bigger voice. Keanu looked up. That's what he wrote about me, but I think it's what I want to say about him now. He closed the book. There was a silence so complete it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. Another student, maybe 16, raised his hand and asked, Was he your real dad? Keanu didn't answer right away. He looked down at the gloves, the wrench, and the flannel shirt. Then back up. He realest man I've ever known. After that, no one said anything for a long moment. It wasn't awkward, it was reverent. Keanu could see it in their faces. Something had landed. Something had settled in them, deeper than words. Mr. Halpern finally stepped forward and placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. That's going to stay with them a long time. Keanu smiled, quiet. I hope so. Before leaving, he walked over to one of the workstations where a student had been struggling with a seized bolt on a brake caliper. Keanu crouched beside him, nodded at the wrench. Mind if I try? The kid moved aside. Keanu gripped the tool, gave it a measured twist, and the bolt let go with a soft snap. There you go, he said. Sometimes it's not about strength, it's about finding the right angle. He stood and turned back to the group. I'm leaving Frank's gloves and this wrench here, Keanu said, placing them carefully on the bench. Not to be put in a case. Use them. Learn with them. Let them get dirty again. That's what he would have wanted. As the students filed out of the shop, one of the youngest lingered by the bench, tracing his finger over the worn leather gloves. Keanu noticed, walked over, and gently handed the boy the flannel shirt. You keep this, Keanu said. It's not fancy, but it's stitched with patience. And if you wear it when you work, maybe you'll feel a little of what he gave me. The boy clutched it to his chest, speechless. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees lining the schoolyard. Keanu stood by the exit doors for a while, looking up at the sky. He didn't need a camera crew or a quote in the paper. What mattered had already been said. Before he left, he wrote one final line in Frank's notebook. His silence taught more than most people's shouting ever could. And underneath it, he added, Lesson passed, still building. Then he wrapped the book in its cord, placed it back in his bag, and stepped out into the fading light, quietly carrying the legacy of the man who had once fixed a car and never left. It took Keanu 3 weekends to build it. He didn't tell Frank or Patricia. He just showed up with lumber in the back of a borrowed pickup truck, tools packed neatly in a canvas bag, and an old thermos filled with black coffee like the kind Frank always made. The plan was drawn in the back of Frank's notebook. Nothing fancy, just clean lines and notes written in Keanu's blocky handwriting. The place he chose wasn't random. It was the little slope beneath the maple tree next to the garage, the one where the light always hit just right around 4 in the afternoon. That was where Frank used to sit after long hours under the hood of someone else's problem. No phone, no newspaper, just a folding chair and the breeze. Keanu remembered once, when he was 13, sitting next to him in the grass, neither of them talking, just chewing on grilled cheese and watching the sky change colors. He remembered thinking back then, I want to grow up into this kind of quiet. Now, he wanted to give something back. He measured twice, cut slow, sanded every surface with patience. When the first screw split the wood, he took the piece out and started over, just like Frank would have. The stain was a deep chestnut, chosen not for style but because it reminded him of Frank's old flannel and the rich tone of oil-soaked wood. The smell of it lingered in the air as he brushed on the last coat. When the bench was finished, he didn't celebrate. He just stood there for a long time, looking at it. It wasn't just a place to sit. It was a piece of their story, something rooted, handmade, something permanent. He opened a small box and pulled out the plaque he had ordered, built by hands that never asked for credit. He drilled it into the backrest with quiet reverence. It gleamed against the warm wood, subtle and strong. The next afternoon, he returned with 2 mugs of coffee and knocked on Frank's back door. When Frank answered, Keanu just nodded toward the tree. They walked out together, no words spoken. Frank stopped when he saw it. His eyes scanned the bench, the craftsmanship, the plaque. He didn't say a word, just let out a breath and sat down slowly. Keanu joined him. Nothing more needed to be said. The moment, like the bench, spoke for itself. The 2 men sat side by side, coffee warming their hands, the air filled with nothing but rustling leaves and the occasional distant bark of a neighbor's dog. The silence wasn't awkward. It was what they knew best. It was the language they had always spoken, unspoken, understanding, shaped by years of showing up, helping out, keeping steady. Keanu rested his arm on the back of the bench and let his gaze drift across the yard. The garage stood quietly nearby, its windows catching the golden light. From here, he could just see the corner of the radio antenna poking out, the very one that played old country music every Saturday when Frank tuned in and tinkered with something, whether it needed fixing or not. Frank finally broke the silence. "It's a good bench." Keanu nodded. "It'll last a long time. I can tell." Frank took another sip of his coffee, then leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "I built a lot of things in my time, but not many that stuck." Keanu turned toward him. "This one will." Frank gave a slight nod. "That plaque, I don't know if I deserve that." "You do," Keanu said softly. "You didn't just fix engines. You built people." Frank didn't reply, but his jaw tightened just slightly. His fingers curled around the mug, knuckles pale from age and time. Then he set the cup down on the grass and leaned back against the bench, letting out a slow breath. "I used to think I'd never leave anything behind," he said. "Didn't have a family, didn't have kids. Thought when I went, it'd just be a quiet goodbye. You left more behind than most fathers ever do." Frank glanced sideways at him, eyes tired but grateful. That's when the back door creaked open and Patricia stepped out, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan. She didn't say anything at first, just stood on the porch looking at the 2 of them, sitting together under the maple like it was always meant to be that way. She walked down the steps and crossed the grass slowly. When she reached them, she placed one hand on Frank's shoulder and the other on Keanu's. "Look at you 2, she said, voice catching slightly. "You finally built something that doesn't need fixing." They didn't respond. They didn't need to. It was enough just to sit there, beneath that tree, on that handmade bench. 3 lives interwoven not by blood, but by choice. And by love that never needed announcing. They stayed out there for over an hour, the 3 of them, occasionally talking, mostly quiet. Keanu leaned back into the wood, feeling its firmness, its comfort. It wasn't just a bench. It was a foundation. A reminder that roots don't always grow from the ground. Sometimes they grow from people. At one point, Patricia went inside and came back with a photo. It was faded, folded in the corner, but the image was still clear. Young Keanu, maybe 7 or 8, covered in grease, holding a socket wrench nearly half his size, while Frank crouched behind him, guiding his hand. She handed it to Keanu. "Found this in an old drawer last night." He smiled as he took it. "I remember this. I was trying to fix the neighbor's lawnmower, and Frank kept saying, 'Just don't lose the screws.' I lost every single one. Frank let out a low chuckle. Still finished the job, didn't we? We did, Keanu nodded. You never let me quit. Patricia sat between them on the bench now, folding her arms around both their backs like wings. The wind rustled through the leaves above, scattering sunlight in dancing patterns across their feet. Keanu glanced up at the tree, then back at the plaque. He whispered, mostly to himself, "Built by hands that never asked for credit." "That's you, Frank." Frank didn't speak. His throat moved like he was going to say something, but nothing came out. He just reached over, gave Keanu's shoulder a firm squeeze, and let it stay there. Patricia laid her head on Frank's arm, the way she used to when they'd sit out on the porch together after long days. Keanu placed the photo between them on the bench, pressing it gently under the edge of the coffee mug so the wind wouldn't take it. Time didn't seem to pass. The world moved on outside their yard. Cars going by, kids shouting down the street, life humming forward. But under that tree, it was still, not frozen. Keanu didn't feel divided between the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. In that moment, with Frank to one side and Patricia on the other, he felt exactly as he was meant to be. Not a movie star, not a public figure, just a son, on a bench beside the man who raised him by showing up. And for the first time in a long time, he felt entirely at peace. Winter came quietly to Toronto that year. The maple tree outside Frank's garage shed the last of its leaves in one long weekend of wind, and the bench beneath it collected a soft blanket of frost each morning. Keanu visited more often now. He didn't need a reason. Just a cup of coffee in his hand and the habit of showing up. Frank had slowed, not dramatically, not all at once, but the signs were there. His steps were shorter. His hands ached more. He didn't talk about it, of course. That wasn't Frank's way. He still shuffled into the garage most mornings, still wiped down his tools like they were sacred objects, still tuned the radio to the same station that played old Johnny Cash and Merle Haggard tracks. But he leaned on the bench more, sat longer between tasks. One Saturday afternoon, Keanu found him out there with a cloth in one hand, polishing the same wrench he'd probably polished 100 times. Frank didn't look up when Keanu approached. "You working?" Keanu asked. Frank shrugged. "The wrench needed a shine." Keanu smiled and sat down beside him. They didn't speak for a while. The silence felt different now. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just full of all the things they didn't need to say anymore. Eventually, Frank set the wrench down, folded the cloth in half, and looked out across the yard. "I've been thinking," he said. Keanu turned to him. "Yeah?" Frank nodded slowly. "About time. How fast it goes. How slow it feels sometimes, but it sneaks up on you anyway." He let the thought settle. Keanu waited. "I didn't do everything right," Frank continued, "but I did what I could. Tried to stay steady. Tried to fix what I could reach." Keanu's voice was low. "You did more than that." Frank turned his head slightly. There was a look in his eyes Keanu hadn't seen before. Soft, glassy, somewhere between pride and goodbye. "You did good, kid," Frank said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Keanu felt something shift inside him, like a beam settling into place, like something heavy finally being set down. "Thanks, Frank." They sat there a while longer, watching the light change. Neither said much more. It was one of those afternoons where everything important had already been said, or didn't need to be. Eventually, Frank stood, slower than usual, and gave Keanu's shoulder a light pat. He didn't say goodbye. He just said, "See you next week." But the next week, Frank didn't come to the garage. Patricia called Keanu late that Monday morning. Her voice wasn't frantic, just quiet, shaky. She said Frank hadn't wanted her to say anything sooner, but the doctor had found something a few months back. It had been moving faster than expected. He was resting now, mostly sleeping. Keanu flew out that night. He sat at Frank's bedside for hours, read him passages from his old notebook, played music softly from a little speaker, Nothing fancy, just the stuff Frank liked. Sometimes he'd talk. Other times he'd just hold his hand. Frank didn't open his eyes again, but there were moments when Keanu thought he could feel his hand twitch in response, just faintly, like a signal coming through the static. And then one morning Patricia called again. There was no panic in her voice. "He went in his sleep," she said. "Didn't want to fuss." Keanu stood in the middle of his kitchen in Los Angeles, gripping the phone, feeling something close and cavernous inside him crack wide open. He flew back home for the last time. The service was small, just close friends, neighbors, and a few kids Frank had helped over the years, now grown. A few teachers, some folks from the hardware store. No speeches, no grand eulogy. Just a mechanic's jumpsuit hung gently over the back of a church pew and Frank's toolbox resting at the altar. Keanu sat with Patricia in the front row, his hand wrapped tightly around the journal Frank had given him. He hadn't let go of it since. After the service, one of Frank's old friends handed Keanu a key. It was to the garage. "He wanted you to have it," the man said. Said it belonged to someone who understood how to keep things running. Keanu smiled through wet eyes and nodded. He knew the garage wasn't just about engines. It was about care, presence, showing up every single time, whether the job was big or small. It was about building things that lasted, even if no one ever gave you credit. In the weeks that followed, Keanu visited the garage often. He'd let himself in with that small silver key, flip on the old lights, and just walk the perimeter. Everything had been left exactly as Frank had kept it. Tools sorted by size, rags folded neatly, a line of oil cans along the shelf that hadn't moved in years. It wasn't a place of work anymore. It was a place of memory. There was dust in the corners, yes, but also something sacred in the stillness. Keanu didn't try to change anything. He swept, he wiped things down, but he never rearranged. It felt like the garage was still breathing, and all he was doing was helping it breathe easier. He brought the journal with him one day and set it on the workbench. Then he sat down on the bench by the tree, the one he'd built for Frank, and watched the light fall across the plaque. He could still hear Frank's voice in his head. Gravelly, calm, the kind of voice that never needed to rise to be heard. "You did good, kid." It stayed with him, more than any script ever had. A few days later, Keanu went back inside the garage, opened the notebook, and began writing. Not a film script, not a memoir, just a quiet entry. "The man who fixed things without needing to be noticed taught me how to live with purpose. He never asked for credit, and maybe that's why he deserved it most." He closed the notebook, laid it gently next to the framed photo of the two of them taken years ago. Keanu still a teenager, Frank younger, grease on both their faces, grinning like they just pulled off a miracle. Patricia came by once in a while and brought sandwiches, the way she used to when the three of them sat on the porch. She never stayed long, just long enough to smile at the open garage door and say, "Still running," before heading home. Keanu didn't reopen the garage for business. But every now and then a neighbor would stop by with a busted bike or a squeaky door hinge or a heater that wouldn't kick on. Keanu would nod, roll up his sleeves, and step into Frank's space. He didn't speak much while he worked. He didn't need to, because the greatest voice he carried forward wasn't loud, it was steady. And every time he picked up a tool, he could feel that voice in his hands. The bench under the tree had aged a little. The wood had grayed along the edges, and the bronze plaque had developed a faint patina that caught the light in a softer hue. Still, it held firm, unmoved by years of rain, sun, and passing seasons. It stood exactly the way Frank would have wanted it to. Quiet, steady, useful. Keanu sat there one crisp morning, bundled in a flannel-lined coat, a thermos of black coffee by his side. The garage stood behind him with its door rolled up, just like Frank always left it, even in winter. Inside, the old radio was silent, though still tuned to the same country station it had known for decades. The air smelled like dust, cold metal, and memory. In Keanu's hand was a simple pencil, dull, a little cracked, no eraser, just wood worn smooth by years. It was the same pencil Frank had handed him when he was a boy, on a day when Keanu had come into the garage and asked too many questions at once. Frank hadn't answered any of them. He just reached into the drawer, pulled out the pencil and said, "Figure it out." Keanu never sharpened it. He didn't need to. It wasn't about the graphite. It was about the moment. That small act of trust, that invitation to try, to think, to become. He turned the pencil in his fingers, tracing the shallow ridge where his grip had once worn into the wood. Then he looked out across the yard, toward the faded maple tree with its bare branches curled skyward. Frank was gone, but not absent. His presence still lived in the soil, in the rhythm of the wind, in the groove worn into the bench where he used to sit. It lived in the creak of the cabinet hinges in the garage and in the outline of his work gloves, still hanging on the pegboard. Keanu closed his eyes and let the silence fill him. Then, without ceremony, he spoke into the stillness. "You were always here." Not loud, not dramatic, just the truth. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper from Frank's journal, an old page loose from the binding. In blocky, slanted handwriting, it read, "Fix what you can. Stand for what matters." Keanu read it once, then again. Then he smiled and let the words settle into the space beside him, as if they too were sitting on the bench, keeping him company. Keanu folded the paper and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he turned slowly toward the camera, his face lit by the soft morning light breaking through the branches. His voice came steady, quiet, honest. "Not every man is called dad," he said, "but some become it anyway, not with words, but by showing up." He looked down at the pencil in his hand, then at the bench beneath him, as though trying to measure all the years that had passed since that first moment Frank showed up without needing to be asked. "This place," he said, "it taught me more than any classroom or studio ever could. Not because someone gave lectures, but because someone kept fixing what was broken, even when nobody else was looking." He paused, the wind brushing gently across his shoulders. A few dry leaves skittered across the driveway behind him. The garage stood open, still and waiting. "If this story moved you," he continued, "like, share, and subscribe. And maybe thank the one who never asked to be thanked, the one who listened more than they spoke, who stayed, even when it wasn't their job to." Then he placed the pencil beside him on the bench and reached into his bag. From it, he pulled a wrench, one of Frank's old ones. The handle still had the same worn grip, the same scratch along the side from the time Keanu had dropped it as a teenager and Frank had laughed. "Well, it's yours now." He set the wrench down gently next to the pencil. One tool to build things. One tool to understand them. Side by side, resting on wood carved from memory. Keanu didn't look at the camera again. He just leaned back against the bench, breathed in the cool air, and let the stillness say what was left. The frame held for a moment longer. Then it faded to black. And there, in the final shot, under a soft beam of morning light, lay the pencil and the wrench. Quietly, side by side. No spotlight, no music, no applause. Just two tools, and the legacy of a man who fixed more than engines. A quiet hero. A real father